Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, welcome to another episode of Professor Game, and today we have Bobby. But Bobby, before we get started, are you prepared to engage?
Make it so.
Let's make it so, because Bobby Lockhart is an award-winning designer of instructional games. He has designed and developed games based on popular intellectual properties like Jurassic World and Batman, and has created games for institutions like the Notebaert Nature Museum and the Anti-Cruelty Society. His games have been shown at the Bit Bash Festival, Alt.Ctrl at GDC, and the Games Learning Society Conference. He's also an expert blogger on game design at gamasutra.com and has given talks at Play, Make, Learn, MDev, and the Game Developers Conference. So many exciting things going on in your world, Bobby. Is there anything else that we're missing out with that intro?
Well, as of yesterday, that Alt.Ctrl game has also been shown at Out of Index in Korea.
There you go. We have some updates. Fantastic.
Yeah.
So, Bobby, we are very curious, and before we dive into deeper content, we do like to know, what does the life of our guests look like? So what would be an example day of Bobby look like, or a regular week, something like that? What does it look like? What does it feel like to be Bobby Lockhart these days?
Sure. So I get up at a fairly normal time most days, like between 7:30 and 8, and take out my cute little dog, get ready, and go to my desk that I rent at the Indie City Co-op, which is a co-working space solely for game developers in the Chicagoland area. And the first 2 hours of the day, from like 9 to 11, I work on stuff related to my independent educational games company, Important Little Games. So lately that has been mostly things related to our game Codemancer, which is out now on like any platform basically. So we're adding like localization right now. We're making a web demo. I have to make sure that the company has liability insurance and stuff like that. And then at 11 o'clock, that becomes 9 o'clock West Coast time. And I work a normal 9 to 5 their time for Code Combat, which is a different game that teaches programming. It's web-based, and we're working on the new product from Code Combat called Ozaria. And so I'm basically doing level design and implementation in these web-based tools for them for most of the day. I don't eat lunch because I do intermittent fasting, and it's like really convenient not to eat lunch. And then I wrap up and go home around 7 o'clock. I walk another 8 minutes back to my apartment and greet my lovely wife, and we have dinner and do whatever needs to get done in the evening, chores. And
sounds very lovely. Just 8-minute walk from work. That sounds very
yes,
enticing.
It's fabulous. Highly recommend.
I'm very happy about having a 25-minute walk, but 8-minute walk sounds very enticing as well, I have to say.
That's not much difference. You get a little extra contemplation time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I mean, both things have their ups and downs. I mean, for me, it's nice as well to have it a bit longer, just to if there's any trouble that you have on your mind when you're at work, I don't want to bring it back home. So it gives me the opportunity to listen to, I don't know, like a there's one podcast I also listen to which has nothing to do with most of the things I do, which has to do with like horror stories. Something completely different.
Yeah, palate cleanser.
Exactly, exactly. That's kind of the mood that I use pretty often when I come back to work. And that's the good thing is I open the door at my house. My wife asks me like, "How was work?" And it's like, I don't know, I don't remember. Every now and then. But it's nice as well. But 8 minutes is oof, nice job.
Well, yeah, it's not an accident.
Yeah,
We
I'm
moved
sure.
here to make that happen.
By design, by design. So
Yes.
Bobby, we would like to, the first thing we like to know of our guests is because sometimes we hear these awesome these awesome intros, and we see all the incredible things our guests are doing, like yourself, and we say, well, wow, these people, they got it figured out, and they don't make any mistakes, and how will I ever get there? And I make mistakes every day. And we like to flip the script a bit, and in that sense, that first question is about failure. And we would like you to tell us a story of what you would call perhaps your favorite fail or first attempt in learning. When creating games, game based learning, especially if it's on game based learning, that actually, of course, in the end sets you up for future success, or maybe that you ended up turning around and the game was a massive success. Wherever you want to take us down, but it's important to have that difficult moment and how you were able to again either get out of it, go through it and get to the better times or whatever that was.
Sure. I mean, yeah, that's great. That's a great question. And I somewhat anticipated it because I have listened to the show before. But I'm gonna go with, well, working on my independent game, Codemancer. I
And of course, if you want to keep any names or companies or whatever outside, sanitize it. We're happy to.
absolutely,
We're
yeah,
more
no,
interested
don't
in the
worry.
story.
All names have been changed to protect the innocent. Um, that is a reference that Americans will get. um, the so I'm going to go with this. Basically, I have often, because it's an independent studio, um, I have basically done or oversaw everything that's related to Codemancer, and that's not something that I had done before. Usually when you work as a game designer, you are super involved in the early um, sort of brainstorming and specification of the systems of the game, of the overall story, and then you get into the nitty gritty and you're working on level design and any particular mechanics that are needed for short-term things, and you're scripting cutscenes, whatever needs to get done. But then once the game is sort of working on a baseline level, as in like you can play through it, the role of the game designer becomes less and less important, because that's when that's when the pros step in, and they replace your boxes with real art, and they replace your dumb screaming into your computer with real sounds, and they write real non-hacky code, and the marketing people create ad campaigns, and this whole team sort of makes the games worthy of actual consumption. But meanwhile, you're moving on to the next thing. Well, for Codemancer, there was none of that, because I, I had to do or be involved with absolutely everything, and that meant that I seriously underestimated how long it would take. And it's shocking how much I underestimated how long it would take, especially given that I shipped games before. Like it was not my first rodeo, as they say, but it turned out to be my first rodeo because I thought it would take a year to make Codemancer. It took 5 years.
Oh wow.
Yeah, how do you overshoot a schedule by 4 years? Well, I'll tell you how. You have to, you have many jobs in the interim, and you ship about 2 games a year for your day job while you're working on it. Turns out that that is not something that supports a fast speed of development. But, on top of that, I wasn't really good about being honest with myself about those delays. I kept thinking like, well, it the game is nowhere near done, but we're 4 months from when I said we'd be done. So by then maybe we can pull it out if we put our nose to the grindstone or whatever. And I would say that over and over. I'm just an incorrigible optimist, Rob. That's my only defense.
What would you say, like from that experience that you had? Because I'm guessing that your main challenge here was timing, and of course that has a waterfall of other consequences. But what would you say here is maybe a key lesson? I mean, if you were to write something different than Codemancer, a new game on your indie studio, which I'm guessing and hoping that you will do as well, what would be some things that you would do differently?
Well, for one, I think having an actual business partner is something that I'm really hoping I can manage before the next big project kicks off. Someone who I can sort of be accountable to for my actions and also just discuss when such things are happening. And ideally, that person is a lot more organized than me, perhaps filling the role of the producer. In game studios, a project manager is called a producer, basically. Yeah. So one is like recognizing that weakness and trying to fill it with a person, and then hopefully giving that person enough power, like, making them a partner so that they can actually fulfill that role.
That makes sense because it's also true that we can be great at doing some things, but we cannot be great at doing absolutely everything on every single thing in the world. And of course, games, video games, serious games, game-based learning, all the things that are involved around games have many different roles to be fulfilled. And if we try to be all, then there is a big chance we won't be doing absolutely everything as good as we might if we were, working with somebody who was specialist in this or that. So I guess that's a very, very important learning. And
Preach.
for people who haven't been into game design before, maybe teachers, maybe professors, maybe, somebody who's in marketing and is thinking about doing something like this, I'm sure your current capacities can take you to many, many places and that there's many things that you can learn. But there's also people you can bounce off your ideas of. I mean, sometimes, because this is, of course, I'm guessing Codemancer, as far as I remember, is in a way is a commercial venture that you're having, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, if you're going down that route, as Bobby was mentioning, it probably makes sense to have a partner. But even if it's not something commercial, there's other people in your world around there, and there's a lot of generous people that are, in the internet. You can find them on Twitter. You can listen to past guests who offer even their personal email to contact them and bounce ideas off of. And so there's, I think that the key there is recognizing where do you need some help, and, in whichever way that might come, seeking out for that help. Would you agree,
Yeah,
Bobby?
absolutely. None of the games that I've made, like, I definitely would not have gotten anywhere in games, and especially not learning games, if I hadn't gotten involved in my local game development community. And as I say, like, I work at this co-working space where everyone around me is working on digital games, not all learning games. In fact, I think I'm the only person working on learning games in the co-op. But regardless, being around people that have similar problems to yourself and being able to discuss them casually without worrying about hierarchies and politics, and just sort of sticking with this group of people, I think is important too. Because if you go to your local game developer meetup, you're going to meet a bunch of people, but I don't know. I think you may feel shunned or whatever because some of these people will know each other well, and honestly, they won't know how serious you are about it. So if you keep going and keep going, and everyone realizes they can't get rid of you, eventually you'll sort of be led into the club, and that grants you a level of support that is really reassuring.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, being there, over and time again makes you a real part of that community for sure. I can tell you from the podcast, I'm sure that very few people from, the first at least 20, 30 episodes, very few people took this very, very seriously. But now, when I say it's 103, 100, well, I'm not sure what the number of this episode will be, but this week we had 103 episodes. I mean, people are starting to take it,
Yeah,
a bit more
absolutely.
seriously, yeah.
As well they should.
Absolutely. And Bobby, shifting, 180 degrees, what would you say is a story in which you were setting out, to overcome a very interesting challenge, and you were actually able to make it again in your independent studio, in your day job, wherever you wanna take us to, in of course in the world of educational games or game-based learning, however we wanna frame it.
Yeah, I would say that I have overcome a lot of design problems, especially with Codemancer, because I've again sort of foolishly set my own schedule, which means that I gave myself time to solve pretty much every problem that I encountered, which is not a luxury that I have in every game that I work on. Sometimes, we have to get this out, and good enough is good enough. But there were some design problems with Codemancer that people suggested solutions to, which I dismissed at the time, and then literally 1 year later realized I could make work, under certain conditions, and that it was actually the perfect advice for me. But it took a year of thinking about the problem to get there. So, for example, somebody suggested that I use, actually Ryan Wiemeyer of The Men Who Wear Many Hats suggested that I use radial menus for the commands in Codemancer. And that suggestion, I think, was prompted by a different game called Frozen Synapse, which is sort of a turn-based tactical simulator game, which, you could describe Codemancer that way, although, it's mostly non-violent or violent towards non-living entities. But what I pictured from that is something that totally doesn't make sense for my game, like having it all sort of live in the play field like Frozen Synapse does. However, you may notice now that the programming interface for Codemancer has radial menus, which it didn't at the time. And so, in a sense, completely correct. And there's probably 4 or 5 examples like that where somebody told me to do something and I said, nah, that's dumb. And then went away for 1 year and then realized actually that was genius.
Yeah, which just happens. I mean, that's something that could happen.
Yeah.
And that probably comes from other people's experience, and that comes from, taking advice. And maybe initially it's a hard pill to swallow that somebody might, understand some things, like seeing it from the outside better than you who are in the inside and know, everything about whatever it is that you're doing. So I think a key lesson there is, once again, like listening to your peers or listening to other people who might even have more experience than you. And there's, I don't know, I would say 99.99% of the times at least, there is somebody who knows something better than you, which could be about the overall experience. It could be about something very specific. And there's people out there who are willing to, lend a helping hand. And it's important to know when to listen, when not to, which is, it's also important to remember they're not always right, but considering those things is very important.
Absolutely. And I have no regrets about it. I have no regrets whatsoever because it took me a year not to realize that their advice was correct. Obviously, I remembered their advice, at least. But also a year to figure out what that means for your project, and how to implement it correctly. So, like a piece of advice is not a game design document. It's a pretty small amount of information, all things considered.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and seeing how to incorporate that is very, very important as well.
Exactly.
And we've heard about Codemancer in both questions and understanding, some of the things that you went through and some of the learnings that you had. And I would like to know when you're facing a project as a game designer, of course there is a game design document, but is there some sort of process that you follow? It could be the creative process, it could be how do you, face your game design document, whatever route you want to take us through. Because we want to know if there's any sort of process when you're creating these things that you follow or would like to follow. How does it look like?
Wow.
Maybe a
Well,
series of steps or whatever.
yeah, I mean, unfortunately, projects are very different often. So some of my favorite games that I've developed, I've just dived in and made a prototype. And then that prototype, luckily, prototypes kind of sell themselves. You don't have to like explain anything about them. Maybe you have to hand wave a little, like, oh, this is going to look a lot better, and this bug will be fixed in the final version or whatever. But that's a way to get sort of the vision of a game down in a very concrete way that everyone can understand.
And how would you say you can get to a prototype?
Well, I mean, it depends on the type of game again, but like when I was at Toy Studio, I made several prototypes in Pygame because Python is a language that's really easy to write. Even though I knew that the final version, A, would be written by our very talented programmers, and B, would be written in frameworks that were more cross-platform, etc. But if you can get something playable into the hands of people who you want their buy-in, and they enjoy it, then sort of it's end of story. Whereas like if you give people a game design document, even like the best game design document, which I can tell you more about what I think those are, but even if someone is enthusiastic about the idea, it's hard to say how it will play, how it will feel in your hands, when you're interacting with this game. And that's going to be something that you are continuing to specify over the lifetime or over the whole development process.
That makes sense. So you would rather go as directly and as straight into some sort of prototype where people can touch and feel that as possible.
Yeah, and the next best thing is to do a paper prototype for a digital game, and you can sort of board gamify a lot of digital game mechanics and things, especially if you can even do this with an action game if you have the help of some willing friends. The people can be buttons, so like you could do a paper prototype of Mario Brothers if you wanted, but you just need someone to be jump and someone to be run and someone.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool.
But next best is to make a really nice game design document. And I really love the philosophy of Stone Librandi, who is a game designer who used to work at Maxis, worked on the last SimCity game. I hope not the last forever, but the last one in recent memory. And then is now at Riot Games, makers of League of Legends. And his game design documents are purely visual, purely diagrammatic, and are just amazing. First of all, they're works of art, so which makes them more palatable for people. Most of the time, when people write text-based game design documents, they become stagnant, and eventually no one refers to them anymore. Which is okay, because hopefully by then they've sort of got the picture. sometimes, the designer makes some changes to the game design document, and they'll like even notify people like, oh, this was changed. But if you miss that email, no one's going back to the game design document on a regular basis. However, if you have the game design document as a poster that lives in your office, and you're coding up a feature, and you can see how it works in this diagram, and you can always like look over your left shoulder and to refer to the game design document at a glance without any reading, it's a lot more likely that it'll get done and without any miscommunication. And
It sounds though as it requires a lot more of experience and talent to do something like that. However,
it does. And I still haven't managed. So Stone the Brandy calls the one-page game design document, and by one page he means one giant wall-sized poster page. Yeah, exactly. And I've still never managed to do that entirely. I make, for each mechanic, I'll make a diagram that's, that as specific as I can make it.
Yeah,
and then there's lots of descriptive text, and then there's the next diagram. So I'm working towards it, and hopefully someday I'll be good enough to just make one giant poster that everyone can look at and understand the whole game in the details.
Fantastic. Just a quick break before we continue with this episode. If you've been enjoying this podcast, I would really appreciate if you share it with your friends and family and on social media. On Twitter and Instagram, it's at RobAlvarezB and hashtag ProfessorGame, all one word. And in Facebook, you can find the Professor Game page. Thanks in advance for your engagement. So Bobby, what would you say is something that almost any game-based learning project could benefit from? Any game for education, anything in this sort of area? Is there some sort of best practice or something that you say, well, think about this or use this kind of strategy, think about these things, and you will always get something that is even a little or a lot better than what the original product would have been?
Yeah, I mean, two things. I'm think a lot about. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about team makeup because my independent studio is at sort of a crossroads right now where we're figuring out what the next product is and what the next team will be. So you've got to have people who are pedagogy experts, subject matter experts, and game design experts. And unfortunately, you can't skimp on those three roles. Some roles can be multiple in one. Live in one person. But if you think, well, I will learn the subject matter as I go along in this project, or I will learn more about pedagogy, as the project moves forward, it's real rough going. It's really nice to have. So most game development teams, you want to make sure at the beginning that you have like a game designer, a producer, and an artist and a programmer. And again, some of those roles can live in the same person. But with educational games or transformational games, I think those extra two roles are really critical. And you may want to try and fool yourself into thinking you can get away without having them, but you can't.
Yeah, it's an easy route out to, maybe a failure that was avoidable, which is always important to be able to avoid those failures.
For sure. And then philosophically, what I would say is if you may have heard this in some form before. I know that you have, Rob, but you, the listener, may have heard this in some form before, but I call it sort of the fundamental theorem of educational game design. And I'm blanking on his name because I'm so bad with names. Oh, yes, Scott Osterweil was the person who first articulated this for me. And who knows if he originated it or what. But the idea is the central mechanic of your learning game must be precisely the thing that you want to teach. If the learning goals are peripheral in any way, then learning that subject will be optional. And beyond that, when you make the central mechanic of your game identical to the content or skill that you want to learn or that you want to teach, you get all the benefits of normal game design. So, like, every game needs to teach the player how to play itself. And sometimes it's very ham-fisted because people are familiar with the genre. So, like, they already kind of know that X is the jump button and trigger to shoot or whatever.
Yeah.
So you can kind of skate over that. But in a lot of cases, you have to, really tutorialize. And there's a lot of art around that, prior art. And you can take advantage of all that prior art if your central mechanic is in service of the learning goal. Yeah, itself.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we have on one hand, your advice was to split these three responsibilities on different people, which are game design itself. You have the pedagogical side, and you have the subject matter expert.
Not necessarily, and you just have to have all of those roles. They don't have to be different people.
Okay, that makes sense. And the other one was on the sort of philosophy side that you were mentioning right now. Is that correct?
Yes.
So there you go, engagers. We have a lot of good advice for things that get our game designs very good. Oh, and mentioning it, the philosophy itself is to have the core of the game itself be the learning that you want your learner to achieve. All right. So those are the two nitty gritty. He explained very well. So if you didn't catch something of that, go back a few seconds, a few minutes, and catch it completely because it was full of a lot of interesting stuff.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of successful counterexamples. Like I point.
Those could be the exceptions that confirm a good rule.
So like I think mostly those successes are based on marketing, because like Math Blasters is exactly the opposite. Math Blasters has like fun games that intermittently are interrupted by learning content, and the mechanic is not. The central mechanic has nothing to do with the learning goals whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, but success can be measured in different ways, Bobby.
Yeah, and the name is kind of irresistible, Math Blasters. So so they get away with it somehow.
Yeah. Bobby, after listening to some of these questions, to the vibe of the podcast, you mentioned you've heard a few episodes as well. Is there somebody that comes to your mind, somebody that you would like to listen to in an interview like this one in Professor Game, somebody that you haven't heard or you would like to hear? Anybody comes to mind?
I mean, I have so many heroes in this area that I'd love to see you interview. Scott Osterweil being one of them. He's the head of the MIT Education Arcade. And also, Jesse Schell of Schell Games.
Jesse Schell. He's actually episode 102, 103. Maybe I'm missing.
Oh, you know what? I knew that.
Yes.
I'm such a dummy. Yes. I listened to that episode.
It's a fantastic episode as well.
It is a fantastic episode. Ugh. I feel like a dummy. It's such a fool.
102. Yes, 102 confirmed. We're on 104 this week with Paul.
Well, in that vein, the Dan Norton and Dan White of Filament Games.
Yeah, absolutely.
A competitor studio.
Well, Dan Norton is 101, right before Jesse, actually.
You're covering all the bases.
Yeah. I mean, I hope so. I know that there's a lot more. I'm sure I will have at least another 100 episodes, hopefully, if everything goes well. But
well, here's one. Mimi Ito. Did you get her already?
Amy?
Mimi Ito.
Mimi Ito. No, definitely not. No, never heard of her.
She is a learning games researcher from so early days, and has written a ton of very influential books. Engineering Play, Imago.
Fantastic. And in that same zone of books, if you were going to recommend a book to the engagers, to this audience, which book would you recommend and why?
Do you think that? Well, I'm going to assume that most of you fine engagers out there are coming to game design from education. Do you think that's fair to say?
Okay, that could be. Yeah.
Well, in that case, I would say Anna Anthropy and Naomi Clark's book, A Game Design Vocabulary.
Huh. Never heard of that one. Interesting.
It's I make it a habit to sort of try and read every game design book that seems reputable. And, honestly, that number is not too high, so it's a very achievable goal. And as far as introductory game design books, that is my current favorite.
Fantastic.
As much as I love art of game design, a game design vocabulary is more concise, more specific.
I'll check that one out. I had never heard about it before, so that's a great recommendation for me as well.
Happy to hear it. Yay. Finally contributing some new content.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Every single section of this has been new and interesting content for sure. So, Bobby, what would you say is your superpower when creating these game-based learning?
I'm going to say patience.
5 years.
Yeah.
Nobody can say no to that.
It's worked for other projects too. You know what? May I amend that? My mantra when I go into game design meetings is I don't have the best ideas, just the most ideas. So I would say that just generating lots and lots of ideas is one of my strongest
Cool.
suits.
Cool. Yeah.
And some of them are terrible. Most of them are terrible. But I have like 10 notebooks from the last 5 years full of game design ideas and specifications and things. And, I recently made a tally of all the game ideas that I am still interested in making that I've thought of at some point. And that number is 35.
There you go.
So basically more than I can get to in my lifetime. So I'm going to have to start prioritizing. But yeah, I like the idea of, sort of generate as many ideas as possible and then sort it out later.
Yeah, sure. So in that same vein of game design and games, what would you say, and this is probably the most difficult question that we always get from our guests, is what would you say is your favorite game?
I hate you. It's so hard. Yeah, I love so many games.
Maybe current, the or maybe the oldest one, the one that most reminds you of how you started, why you started. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the one that was the most instructive for me was The Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess, because it really lays out how the structure of a learning game ought to be, the macro structure. And in that game, you are learning how to use the various weapons and tools that Link is provided, rather than sort of academic content. But it is a learning game in a sense, and you never stop learning things in the game. Like they introduce a weapon, they show you how to use it in a very low stakes environment, then they up the stakes, then they combine it with previously learned weapons and tools, and then you're on to the next new thing that you're introduced to. And then at the end, you basically get a final exam where you have to use absolutely everything back to back.
There you go, a learning game in itself. So, Bobby, we're running out of time, but before I let you go, I want you to tell us where we can find more about you, about what you're doing, about your indie studio, your 9 to 5 maybe, your Twitter, wherever we can find you, and maybe even contact you if we have any further questions.
For sure. Well, the most direct way is through Twitter. I am at Bobby Locks, BOBBYLOX. My independent studio just released Codemancer. Codemancergame.com is where you can find information about that. And codecombat.com is where you can find out about Code Combat and I recommend that you sign up for, well, first of all, buy Codemancer, but also sign up for to get in touch with our team at Code Combat, because this new thing, Ozaria, that we're making is really cool and you won't want to miss out.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for your time, Bobby, for all the wise words that you spilled today here for the engagers, that you let us into your world.
Too kind. I'm sure you have just as much great advice, Rob. You could do a solo episode.
Thank you once again for that. However, for now, and at least for today, it is time to say that it's game over.
Game over, man!
Engagers, it's fantastic to have you here, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with Bobby. Are you using Instagram? I'm getting the grip of it, and I would love to connect with you there. And just like on Twitter, my username is Rob Alvarez B. And of course, as usual, before you go on to your next mission, I'd like to remind you that next week we also have an episode. So if you want to know what it's all about, then subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.